The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
We've got some potentially major geopolitical news breaking today, and I say potentially because it's related to, I guess, unconfirmed reports relating to North and South Korea, and unconfirmed by North Korea. So there's a piece out in the New York Times which says that South Korea is saying that North Korea is willing to talk about giving up their nuclear weapons. And this was the message reportedly from Kim Jong-Un himself through some South Korean envoys, saying, we are ready, we are willing to start conversations about giving up our nukes, and we'd be willing, according to this report, to suspend all nuclear missile tests during these negotiations. And there has also been an agreement, again, this is reportedly as of now, from Kim Jong-Un himself to hold a summit in the South Korean, with the South Korean president, Moon Jae-in, in the border area sometime in late April. And the statement about this says, quote, the North Korean side clearly stated its willingness to denuclearize. It made it clear that it would have no reason to keep nuclear weapons if the military threat to the North was eliminated and its security guaranteed. Now, it's possible that North Korea will deny this. As of right now, what we have is a New York Times report quoting South Korean sources about this. Let's assume for a moment that it's accurate. And I have some skepticism, and I'll tell you why in a moment. If this is accurate, this would be major. This would really be the first time that the Kim regime has indicated that they might give up their nukes if they were given security guarantees. Some of those guarantees would, of course, have to come from the United States, and they'd probably relate to the United States' military presence in South Korea. Now, we've got to be prepared for the reality that if this is true, Trump's going to take credit for it, right? Trump will say it was either his tough talk or his bombing of an empty Syrian runway or his tweets or calling Kim Jong-un Rocket Man or Little Rocket Man or whatever that caused this to happen. And, of course, the truth in the real world is that if this is real, it probably relates more to the overtures made by South Korea, including around the Olympics. You'll remember the athletes from North and South Korea marching together, North Korea sending Kim Jong-un's sister to the event. But you know what? To a certain extent, I say let Trump take credit, or at least try to take credit, because this has the potential, and again, right now, it's just the potential to be a really great thing. And it's not just about, it could be good for the North Korean people, of course. It could be good for the people that might be hit by a North Korean weapon in the region. But the issue of North Korea is also hamstringing China in many ways and the relationships of other countries with China geopolitically, because it puts China, the status quo with North Korea right now, puts China in what's really a suboptimal position in terms of other countries and allies. And taking out the factor of having to constantly push China to convince North Korea to do this or convince North Korea not to do that, this could be a very, very good thing in terms of relationships with China. Now, that being said, I want to get back to some of the caveats here. Number one is, let's assume for a second the reports are completely true and Kim Jong-un said everything that's being reported. If you go back to the Clinton administration, Bill Clinton did actually provide some security guarantees to North Korea in writing at the time. And North Korea said that they weren't the right security assurances. They weren't adequate. They weren't acceptable or sufficient security assurances. So I'm not ready to assume that this is Kim Jong-un putting his best foot forward. It could be a pretext to say, hey, we were willing, but the United States or South Korea or whoever didn't take it seriously. They didn't act correctly. They didn't give us serious guarantees that we were looking for. And I have to say, I hope I'm wrong, right? I hope I'm wrong about this next part. But we have a long history, Kim Jong-un saying the nukes aren't for negotiation, period. In other words, when it has been brought up the possibility of talks that would include stopping the development or stopping the tests or doing away with the nuclear weapons that they have. It's been said time and again by Kim Jong-Un and his officers that that's just not something that's a negotiating point. And he's even gone further. He has said, look at what happened in Iraq. Iraq had sort of one position geopolitically until they agreed to stop nuclear weapons development and get rid of what they had. And then look at what happened to Iraq. So I am very, very skeptical, but cautiously optimistic that this might actually bear fruit.
Yeah, so given your skepticism, do you find it odd that this seems to be a result of the Winter Olympics and South Korea and North Korea seeming to get along adequately for a time?
I mean, the politics is weird, and you can have an impasse for decades and decades, and then you never really know what it is that's going to sort of shake up the situation. I'm sort of agnostic as to what pushes us in a good direction if it does, and I'm sort of waiting to see whether that's actually what's going to happen here.
Yeah, I think back to the Kennedy and Khrushchev meetings, or Reagan and Gorbachev meetings, or even like the Camp David Accords.
You don't always know exactly what circumstances will sort of get you to the table, but if everybody's at the table honestly, then you should take advantage of it. And this, again, I mentioned the American troops in South Korea. The other sort of cynical interpretation of Kim Jong-un's actions, if the reports are exactly accurate, is that this could be about trying to get a guarantee or an agreement or a concession to get American troops out of South Korea. I don't want to underestimate the cynicism of Kim Jong-un. Last thought. Could this be about reunification delusions, right? I don't know. We know that within North Korea and sort of with external PR, North Korea talks about how any second now there's going to be reunification between North and South Korea, even though there's no indication whatsoever that that's going to happen. I don't know whether Kim Jong-un uses that as propaganda or whether he actually believes it. Is that a factor sort of underlying this? I don't know. But what I can assure you is that there will be no deal whatsoever until Trump-Pyongyang Golf Club breaks ground and some Asian guy Trump met last week at Mar-a-Lago is appointed ambassador of North Korea.
Yeah, and it's probably time to get a U.S. ambassador to South Korea as well.
Oh, we don't have one.
We don't have one right now.
Interesting. A lot of one of the many open positions in the world of Trump. Okay, we've got what potentially is pretty major news that has broken in the last 24 hours related to a bunch of different issues. And I want to start with sort of this setup, which is that under most presidencies, the statements of European sex workers, escorts as they are sometimes known, they don't really become relevant in our understanding of how the president came to power in the United States. It's sort of irrelevant. This is a different sort of administration. And the New York Times is reporting, it's not InfoWars, it's not whoever, it's the New York Times, that a Belarusian escort who's connected to this Russian oligarch Oleg Deripaska has 16 hours of audio recordings, which she says prove that Russia meddled in American elections. And you might remember Oleg Deripaska. He's the Russian billionaire that's connected to Vladimir Putin, who also did business with the indicted Trump campaign chairman Paul Manafort. This is an escort named Anastasia Vashukevich, and prepare yourselves for the same people on the left who claim to defend women and argue that everyone should be treated decently regardless of their occupation. Be prepared for that element of the left who is also part of the Russia denier crowd to smear this woman because of her position as an escort, which they've already started to do. Anastasia Vashukevich is currently in prison in Thailand, and she's saying that she will turn over 16 hours of recordings to the United States if the U.S. grants her political asylum. How insane is this? She's currently facing charges in Thailand for allegedly working there without a visa in a sex training seminar. And the frequency with which porn stars, escorts, and prostitutes are coming up in relation to the Trump administration is truly stunning. And I actually don't think we have to make any evaluations of her credibility on the basis of her job. Either the recordings exist or they don't. Either the recordings point to Russian meddling in Trump's election or they don't. And you might say, well, David, is there any reason to think that this random escort who's currently being detained in Thailand might even possibly have these recordings, or is this sort of appearing out of thin air? Well, last night or the night before, there was a 25-minute video investigation that was posted by a Russian opposition figure named Alexei Navalny, which contains many videos and pictures taken by this woman. So at minimum, we can say she has provided videos and recordings previously. The ones that have already been released are videos where she says Deripaska would meet with Paul Manafort. Manafort would give Deripaska information on the Trump campaign and then would get paid for that. And the presumption, of course, is that Deripaska would then go and directly brief Vladimir Putin about what was going on. She says she was modeling when she was sent to a yacht owned by Russian oligarch Deripaska, that the recordings contain admissions related to Russian-American relations and interference, and she claims that some of these recordings contain specific discussions about the 2016 American election. The most important line from the New York Times report could be that some of the recordings she claims to have involve conversations with three people who spoke what to her was fluent American English that she believed to be American. If the tapes exist, and they are what she claims they are, I wonder who those three Americans might be. I don't know, but I would be very interested to know. And I hope that the tapes, if they exist, have been copied and that some kind of fail-safe is in place in case harm comes to her, because that's what I'd be worried about right now.
And there's no greater evidence than tapes, it seems. I mean, you think about what brought down the Nixon administration.
Yep.
It was the tapes. What nearly brought down the Trump campaign, the Access Hollywood tapes.
That's exactly right.
So this could be big.
And I like that we even still use the word tapes. Like at this point, they're probably not even really tapes, but it has this sort of aura around the use of the word tapes. Now, alternatively, we can refrain, it's fake news, nothing to see here. My concern is, if it's true that Trump is compromised by Russia, it might not be safest for Ms. Vashukevich to go to the American State Department for asylum, right? She might actually be better off going to the Netherlands or Germany or somewhere else, because we don't know, depending on who's in charge of granting her asylum in the United States, and depending on which, if any, of the allegations about the current administration are true, I don't know that the people making the decision about her asylum would be inclined to say yes, specifically because they might not want these tapes to be released. There is no doubt in my mind that if she truly has 16 hours of tapes, as she describes, she is certainly not safe in a Thai prison. And hopefully this is going to be, hopefully we have news about a change to where she is sooner than later. I'm on Twitter at @dpacman. The show is on Twitter at David Pakman Show. We'll take a break and just a major breaking news day today.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Today's new member of the day is Thomas Maruski. Thomas, thanks for signing up. We do depend on the support of folks like Thomas through both Patreon and membership to fund the show. And today's sustaining member of the day is Bradley Warwick, who has been a member since June 2nd of 2011. Thanks to all of our new members, sustaining members. You can sign up at davidpakman.com/membership. The new coupon code is VoteSoon18. That'll save you 40%. And if you get a yearly membership, you can also get a free David Pakman Show bumper sticker. Black one, white one, your choice. Just email in after you sign up for your yearly membership and say, hey, I want the white one, I want the black one, and give us your address, and we will get that right out to you. I've mentioned before that there is a second so-called Steele dossier. Christopher Steele, of course, being the author of the Trump-Russia dossier that was the subject of extensive controversy and now connects to multiple investigations by the FBI special counsel, special prosecutor, by the U.S. House, by the U.S. Senate into possible crimes committed by the Trump administration. The lesser-known second dossier is very interesting, and there's a really good piece in The New Yorker that I read yesterday, which talks about this second dossier and points out that more than likely, Christopher Steele discussed both of his memos Dossier 1 and Dossier 2, I guess is what we're calling them, with Special Prosecutor Robert Mueller's investigators. And there is just a gigantic bombshell hidden in plain sight in that second dossier, as well as in the New Yorker article. And as what it asserts is that as far as Christopher Steele's research showed, the Kremlin intervened to block Donald Trump from choosing Mitt Romney as Secretary of State. The reason that Russia allegedly kiboshed Romney as Secretary of State is that they wanted someone who would lift Ukraine-related sanctions. And it was pretty clear that Mitt Romney wasn't going to be the guy to do that. And of course, hindsight is 20/20. We need more information. This is only the beginning. But circumstantially, this makes a lot of sense to me. As I thought back yesterday about what happened between Trump and Romney, you'll remember that Romney was invited during the transition period between the November election and Trump assuming the presidency in January of 2017. Romney was invited to meet with Trump at his New Jersey golf club. He was invited to dinner with Trump, where they famously had turtle soup. It really did seem like Trump was going in the direction of Mitt Romney as Secretary of State. And then suddenly, Romney was out of the running. And at the time, we wondered, is this a power trip by Trump? Is this Trump being so vindictive that he wanted to make Mitt Romney come out and grovel and maybe apologize for the things he said about Trump during the campaign and more or less beg for the job and then give it to somebody else? And personality-wise, at the time, it fit Trump, right? And then we never really learned more about it. But maybe, at least based on this latest information from the second Steele dossier, maybe Trump genuinely planned to hire Mitt Romney as Secretary of State and didn't because Russia intervened. And think about who Trump ultimately did select. Rex Tillerson. Rex Tillerson was specifically known by Russians. He was known to be Russia-friendly. He was once given a medal for being a friend of Russia by Vladimir Putin. We need to learn more, but circumstantially, there's kind of no better explanation for what we saw publicly, which is that Russia said no to Romney, and Trump ended up going with the Russia-friendly guy, which was Rex Tillerson. Now, the White House was asked about this. They said, oh, no, Mitt Romney was never really our first choice. Okay, really hard to ignore the big picture here, which is Trump ended up choosing the Russia friend who got a medal from Putin over the guy who clearly was not going to ease the Russia sanctions. And if your response is going to be, David, fine, Tillerson on paper is more Russia-friendly than Romney, but what has Tillerson's State Department actually done? Well, he's eliminated the Office of the Coordinator for Sanctions Policy at the State Department, for one, which would have been in charge of implementing the sanctions that still to this day have not been implemented. We just learned that Rex Tillerson's State Department has not spent any of the money, any of the $120 million that's been earmarked dating back to 2016 for future elections and stopping Russian meddling, still hasn't spent any of that. So circumstantially, there is a lot here.
Yes, but David, Trump did just endorse Mitt Romney to become the next U.S. Senator from Utah.
Yeah.
So I don't think that's going to convince anyone of anything,
No.
because that's just one vote in the Senate out of 100. It's not nearly
peanuts.
as powerful as the Secretary of State, but
No doubt.
it is something.
It's something, but in the grand scheme of things, and particularly in retrospect, Russia also wouldn't have as much of an interest in trying to prevent Senator Romney. It appears, at least circumstantially, that they'd have a pretty significant interest in preventing Secretary of State Romney. Three major stories, all involving a former Trump aide named Sam Nunberg, breaking in the last 24 hours. Sam Nunberg, number one, has been subpoenaed to testify in Robert Mueller's Trump-Russia investigation, and that is part of story number one, which is he is refusing to testify, saying he will ignore the subpoena. Number two story about Sam Nunberg is that he admitted during an interview on CNN with Jake Tapper that Carter Page was colluding with the Russians. And number three, Sam Nunberg believes that Mueller has something specifically on Donald Trump. Let's at least attempt to break this down into its component parts, and we'll start with the subpoena. Sam Nunberg met with Robert Mueller's investigators a couple of weeks ago. He has been subpoenaed, and he says he will reject the subpoena. He says, come and arrest me. And that is maybe what will actually happen. That is part one. Part two is that he admitted on CNN to Jake Tapper that he believes Carter Page flat out colluded with the Russians. Here he is yesterday during one of his many, many, many weird interviews.
About communications with Carter Page. Do you think I would communicate with Carter Page? Carter Page is a scumbag.
Okay, so the answer is no. You would not communicate with Carter Page.
So the answer is no, and Carter Page was colluding with the Russians.
So Carter Page was colluding with the Russians, you think?
Yes, I believe Carter Page was colluding with the Russians.
Huge, huge. And we'll get back to that. And then we have part 3, which is that Mueller has something on Trump. Nunberg was asked by MSNBC about that. He said, I think they may. And this was, again, part of another one of these just very strange interviews, speculation ranging from just absolute and total panic over what he believes may be a coming indictment from Robert Mueller to maybe just being drunk. The explanations have ranged from the complex to the simple to the insightful. Here is this next comment from his MSNBC interview.
Do you think that they have something on the president?
I think they may.
What?
I think that he may have done something during the election, but I don't know that for sure.
Why do you think that?
I can't explain it unless you were in there.
Explain the atmosphere.
The way they asked questions about anything I heard after I was fired from the campaign.
Yes, and it gets even weirder. This is what panic looks like. He spoke to CNN's Gloria Borger, and just every element of these interviews is outrageous.
So it was only those 3 people they wanted information on?
No.
What else?
I'll send you the full subpoena.
Okay.
And you know what,
okay.
Mr. Mueller, I've been warned not to go after him. I've been warned that you're wrong, that he'll take you down. You know what? Why should I give him every communication I've had from November 1 of 2015 with my mentor, Roger Stone, and with Steve Bannon?
Because you might be arrested if you don't. The White House asked about it. They're writing this all off at someone who flat out didn't work at the White House, period.
Sam Nunberg, the president's former campaign aide, is refusing a subpoena by a grand jury, and he just said on MSNBC moments ago, I think he, meaning the president, may have done something during the election, but I don't know that for sure. Your reaction?
Well, I definitely think he doesn't know that for sure because he's incorrect. As we've said many times before, there was no collusion with the Trump campaign. Anything further on what his actions are, he hasn't worked at the White House, so I certainly can't speak to him or the lack of knowledge that he clearly has.
The idea that a former Trump advisor who was interviewed by Mueller's team saying that Carter Page colluded with the Russians and they may have something on Trump is nothing is downright hilarious because of how impossible it is to believe that. And what is clear here is that whether you believe he was drunk, nervous, or panicked, this is the behavior of a guy who is extremely skittish after his own meetings with Mueller's team. He is extremely scared, and apparently rightly so, based on the questions that were asked and the requests for documents that were made. And there is just no way that this ends well for many, many people. We don't know yet who's on the list of people that this is not going to end well for, but this is a rattled guy. I don't care how you describe it. He's scared. He is very scared.
It's a very bizarre demeanor, and I think that's a defense mechanism for him. I guarantee you that if Mueller is going to present, 5, 10 years of prison if he doesn't cooperate, the guy will turn around real quick.
Yeah, and that wouldn't be the penalty for the contempt, but certainly depending on what it is that Robert Mueller knows in terms of the investigation at large, that doesn't seem unreasonable to me. It's certainly possible 5 to 10 could be on the table there. I'm glad we don't have any vacations planned for a while because I don't want to miss a minute of what's going on here. Let me briefly follow up about the Melania Trump liking our video about her story. Yesterday, we did a story about how on Twitter, Melania Trump briefly liked a post about our video questioning how she got an Einstein visa. Last week, we did a story called How Exactly Did Melania Trump Get an Einstein Visa? And the story a couple days ago was posted about by David Almrod on Twitter, and the official Melania Trump Twitter account, verified with nearly 1 million followers, liked that video, which was weird. By the next morning, that like had been undone. So if you went back to Melania Trump's Twitter, you would have seen that instead of having 3 liked tweets, she had only 1 liked tweet. And I speculated yesterday, it seems the most likely explanation is that Melania or someone using her verified account wanted to watch the video and maybe accidentally hit like, or it's some kind of very, very nuanced trolling or something like that. The story has been picked up to and including by Newsweek. Newsweek actually wrote about the fact that First Lady Melania liked an Einstein Visa tweet with a video criticizing President Trump. That is our video. And the article says that I speculated yesterday that indeed Melania Trump was watching the video and accidentally hit the like button, and later someone decided to unlike it. Are we ever going to know the truth about what happened here? My bet is probably not. But in the meantime, I'll take the media coverage of it, right? We've got Newsweek, the Daily Mail, New York Daily News, the Mercury Observer, and America Online at minimum writing about this. And I guess what I go back to is the frequency with which Twitter becomes a sort of topic of discussion. Behavior on Twitter is a topic of discussion for many people in the Trump family. Is sort of interesting. Who knew 8 years ago, for example, when President Obama was entering his 2nd year as president, that for the next president, Twitter would be just such a big deal? If anybody else has thoughts about what it is that happened here, what it is that explains Melania Trump liking a video where we questioned how on earth she got an Einstein visa, let me know. A lot of discussion about it on our subreddit at davidpakman.com/REDDIT.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
It's great to be joined today by Anirudh Krishna, who's the Edgar Thompson Professor of Public Policy at Duke University. He's been studying and investigating not only how people become poor, but also how they escape poverty. So maybe let's start with the entry into poverty first and then talk about the escape later. In your studies, what sort of categories are there for the circumstances that push people into poverty to begin with?
Hi, David. Thanks for having me on the show.
Pleasure.
Let me start first by backtracking on your question just a little bit, because the question of people falling into poverty is a very recent one. About 15 years ago, people stopped being captivated by the policy question of how do we move people out of poverty. That's still a very important question, but they started asking the parallel question of how do people come to be poor in the first place? Are they all born poor? Seems unlikely. If not, how many weren't born poor but fell into poverty? And if that's a large number, then shouldn't we be doing something to prevent the creation of poverty, to prevent people falling into poverty, even before we step in to offer assistance to move people out? And when they started researching this question, then my colleagues and I found that between 1/3 to 1/2 of all presently poor people were not born poor. They have fallen into poverty within their lifetimes. A number of reasons account for people falling into poverty, but the single most important reason across the majority of countries is bad health and high healthcare costs.
Now, when it comes to healthcare, different countries have very different systems in terms of healthcare, and of course, this is the subject of much political debate. Does the type of healthcare system a country has impact the likelihood of one falling into poverty as a result of health expenses?
Actually, no, David. I mean, what really matters is whether you have a healthcare system that can be called a healthcare system, whether it's financed through taxes, whether it's financed through legal bindings on employers, whether it's financed through personal contributions. That doesn't matter. What really matters is how many people have access to this system easily and how many people have a safety net under them that they're not going to lose the shirt on their back if someone in their family falls seriously ill or has an accident.
Aside from the issue of health expenses, do you see a difference between developed and developing countries in terms of what causes people to fall into poverty in the first place?
So even within rich and poor countries, there are differences. There are some countries where the rate of falling into poverty is very low. And these are the countries that have robust healthcare protection for their citizens. That's rich countries like the Scandinavians or Canada, but also poor countries like Colombia and Costa Rica. But if you were to look at the reasons for falling into poverty that need to be guarded against, healthcare is number one. That's without question everywhere. I mean, the only countries that have single-digit poverty rates are countries that have what I call robust healthcare protection systems. But other reasons for falling into poverty, job loss. Our studies in North Carolina showed that a lot of people had lost their jobs during the period we were doing the study because factories had run away to China or somewhere else. But what was really critical, even in those instances of falling into poverty, was not the job loss itself. Many people lost their jobs. Not everyone fell into poverty. Those who did suffered an additional calamity. And that was the loss of healthcare insurance, followed by a calamitous healthcare incident in the family.
Let me ask you this. You've clearly pointed out that only some of those who are currently poor were born into poverty. But let me ask you a different question, which is, given that one is born into poverty, how likely is it that they will remain in poverty? And if this differs again from country to country or between types of countries, by all means, I'd be curious about that.
So that's the flip side of what we've been talking about. And in essence, an individual has to cope with both sorts of pressures, the pressure pulling that individual down and then the better pressure that's lifting the individual up. Unfortunately, David, what's been happening is that the kinds of avenues that used to be available for people to get better jobs, to get middle-class jobs, during the time of the Industrial Revolution, when lots of farm kids educated to high school could move off the farm and come to cities and get employed on assembly lines, which were rapidly expanding, and get a unionized job and get, an assurance that they're going to be looked after till the day they die and they needn't fear poverty anymore. Those kinds of jobs are not being produced in as large numbers, either in the United States and other developed countries, or even in very poor countries. The spread of advanced technology has been a phenomenon not just in the rich West, but all over the world, wherever there are global value chains. And so the prospect for a kid coming off the farm in Kenya or India or Indonesia or any of this host of largely rural developing countries, the prospects for such a kid to come out from there and get a middle-class job is much, much dimmer than it used to be before. So there is, in some senses, a crisis of moving out of poverty, even as countries themselves are growing rapidly.
The success stories, the people that do move out of poverty, what sort of either circumstances, environments, or activities and decisions does that seem to be related to?
It's related, of course, to the individual's personal ability to begin with and their hard work. So that goes without saying. The problem arises when there are individuals, large numbers, who are smart and work hard and still don't make it. They might make it out of poverty, but what would it be like if you had an Einstein and converted that person into a security guard or a truck driver? I mean, nothing against security guards and truck drivers, but an Einstein should do better than that. what really matters is the availability of a wide and easily accessible pipeline, a pipeline that leads almost seamlessly from the time you're a primary school student to your career, a sort of cradle to career, a nurturing primary school environment, a high school environment in which you are exposed to different opportunities, where you have access to role models who follow different careers, who can then show you the ropes. If you want to do X, then here's how you prepare for it. These are the exams you have to write. This is the additional coaching you need to acquire. This is how you become competitive. Those kinds of pipelines are broken. They're broken. I mean, in most situations of poverty, kids grow up without access to good quality education. They grow up without access to the kinds of role models who could show them the paths forward, beyond becoming what people in their community traditionally become, to becoming something that the new and growing economy is creating by way of better opportunities. Those pipelines need to be mended, David, and there are examples from across the world of how those more accessible and wide pipelines have been put in place.
Now, in terms of, I don't want to sort of ignore the horrible reality of being poor by the American federal poverty line standards in the United States, but there's no doubt that there's a difference between that and sort of the abject poverty of living in a developing country on under $1 a day. Can you talk a little bit about how the path out of poverty might be different when we're talking about the group living on less than $1 a day in the developing world versus someone who is maybe in the United States and might even be working but in poverty? How do those circumstances differ in terms of the opportunity to get out?
Oh, those circumstances differ widely, very widely, David. If you look at the spread of inequality, if you look at, for instance, average asset holdings and compare them with the spread of asset inequality across the world, wealth inequality across the world, the United States occupies the last 20%. Its poorest people are about as poor as the 80th percentile or the 50th percentile. But in India, in China, in Indonesia, in Nigeria, the richest people have as much wealth as the richest 5% in the world. Maybe not the richest 0.1%, but certainly the richest 5%, 1%. But the poorest people are like the poorest people in sub-Saharan Africa. So, and even in sub-Saharan Africa, you have countries which have this spread of inequality. In those circumstances, the struggle to rise out of relative poverty is much, much tougher because you have to go the entire pipeline from 0 to 95. In the US, it's still a struggle. It's still a struggle because of lasting prejudices which block these pipelines, because of structural inequalities which block these pipelines. But there is a floor below which very few people sink, and that floor is not the same as the floor in developing countries, which still require the bulk of the world's assistance.
From a sort of dollars perspective, it seems that aid dollars, to the extent that they're useful, and there's lots of controversy about what types of aid money is useful and sort of counterproductive, we can do much more in terms of the number of people that we lift up in places that are dealing with more abject poverty than in developed countries, right? It's merely because you're talking about each dollar makes a bigger difference in some of these places.
Yeah, that's the financial calculation, but there's also a moral calculation. If you were to think of the world's people as one, if you were for a minute, if you were to not think of them as belonging to different countries, but as belonging to a common humanity, then morally you would start by making sure that no one starves or no one is is homeless. I mean, you can pick your principles and your standards, but then you'll apply the same principle and standards across a common humanity. And that's another reason for doing exactly what you said.
We've been speaking with Anirudh Krishna. He's the Edgar Thompson Professor of Public Policy at Duke University, and he's been working on this issue for the past 15 years. Thanks so much for talking to us about it. Very important work.
Thank you, David. Pleasure.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
It was completely predictable that this was going to happen, and it is. Donald Trump, as I told you yesterday, proposed a 25% steel tariff and a 10% aluminum tariff, and the European Union is now proposing a retaliatory tariff of 25% on a bunch of different goods produced in the United States. And this would hurt American products in European markets, right? This is how it works. And as a chain reaction, as a subsequent effect, it would hurt American businesses. And the list of goods so far would be limited to shirts, jeans, cosmetics, pleasure boats worth over $1 million, orange juice, corn, whiskey, and motorcycles, which is about $3.5 billion of U.S. goods. Not an insane amount right away, but already something that we don't want to ignore, and likely there would be more following it. And I don't know how anyone can be surprised by this, right? Completely predictable. And when we look at, there's already been an analysis done of what the jobs impact would be of these tariffs proposed by Donald Trump. The trade partnership did an analysis. And what it finds is that the tariffs would result in a net loss of about 85,000 American jobs before you account for the impact of the retaliatory tariffs that the EU or Canada or whoever else could put in place. So to put it a different way, Trump's tariffs alone would create 33,500 jobs. They would eliminate 118,500 jobs, and that would be a net loss of 85,000 jobs. But that assumes that no other country reacts to the tariffs in any way. To those jobs lost, you have to then add in, well, what will be the job loss because Europe starts taxing a whole bunch of American goods at 25%. And a few 100,000 jobs are really not gigantic in the scope of the economy at large. On any given month, we gain or lose a couple of 100,000 jobs. But if the point of the tariffs is to protect the American economy and to protect American jobs, if you're going to have a net loss of 85,000 jobs, that means that the policy isn't doing what it's supposedly going to do. So then the question is what could happen next? And that depends on how heavy-handed Trump would want to be, because Trump also has ways to further retaliate, right? Trump says 25% tariff on steel and aluminum. And the EU says, we're doing 25% tariff now on this list of American goods. Well, Trump could strike back again and say, we are now going to put a tariff on, for example, European cars. And this is when it really starts to get dicey, because even though lots of car manufacturers are European, many of them are making cars in the United States, right? And that's why it's not as simple. Trump tweeted a couple days ago that it's easy to win trade wars. If you decide to put a tariff on Volkswagen, for example, are you hurting the company at its headquarters in Germany, or are you hurting the workers at its factory in Chattanooga, Tennessee? And of course, you're sort of doing both, but the impact is going to be much more significant on a worker in Chattanooga, Tennessee, who is going to be much more significantly impacted if that factory is no longer necessary than executives working at the main corporate office in Germany. So that's how this very quickly gets more complex than I think Trump even has a remote understanding of.
Yeah, John Oliver had a great comment about the trade wars are easy to win tweet, which is that if trade wars are so easy to win, then everyone would just win them.
Clearly, not everybody can win the trade wars, and that's often why you see trade wars not even proposed by a lot of countries that sort of understand how a globalized economy works. And that's why I'm wondering, for a guy in Trump who claims to have excelled at Wharton School of Business, he seems to know very little about basic economics. But that's not, I mean, we've talked about the problem of how economics is even being taught in business schools around the country and how problematic that is. In the net, you can't really win the trade war. What you can do, if you have more of a tolerance to a loss of jobs than another country, you can try to sort of lose less than the people you're fighting, or maybe you can stick out some losses more to their detriment, and then you can sort of make it up. It's sort of like a big company who might say, you know what, because we're so big, we are going to sell products at a loss where it's legal to do this. It's not legal everywhere. And we'll temporarily be hurt, but we're going to drive our competitors out of business. And then in the long run, we will be able to actually accumulate more market share, and it'll be a really great thing. That is sort of the only way that you can, in the long term, attempt to benefit from a trade war. But a lot of people in the U.S., if that's what Trump is trying to do, and I don't really think it is, a lot of people in the U.S. are going to be hurt. And even though the country might be able to ride that out, a lot of people can't afford not to have a job for the next 5 or 10 years. And this is so bad that even Republican Speaker of the House, Paul Ryan, says that he's concerned about the impact of this, and it could do serious damage to our relationships with other countries that might say, hey, you know what? Let's circumvent the United States altogether. Let's make alliances that don't even involve the United States. And that's what, as usual, Trump doesn't really seem to be considering.
Yeah, and it makes sense that Paul Ryan is upset about this because motorcycles are big in Wisconsin. Yeah. And that's what Europe is going to place a tariff on. The same thing when it comes to bourbon in Kentucky.
Kentucky whiskey, bourbon rather. Yes. A lot of heartland industries, for lack of a better term, would be significantly impacted by this. I've got what is genuinely good news about net neutrality, if not monumental news, which is that at the state level, Washington State has approved their own net neutrality requirements, which sounds really great, and it's good, but I don't want to pretend like this is some panacea. Washington's the first state to actually enact net neutrality requirements since the FCC repealed the Obama-era net neutrality regulations. Many states are discussing them. Some states have done executive orders. I believe Oregon has agreed to some laws but have not yet enacted them. So what this will do is it will stop any state agencies in Washington State from doing business with ISPs that block, prioritize, or throttle particular internet content or apps. And it'll also force ISPs operating in Washington to disclose the management practices that they're employing there. What this does not do is mandate that ISPs at large can't throttle or prioritize internet traffic or content. That really would be the big thing, right? But listen, it's something, and there are lots of states looking at doing similar things, and we should be, honestly, at this point, glad for anything that can be done. Other states that are looking at similar rules include Hawaii, New Jersey, New York, Montana, and Vermont. But I think that there's actually sort of a bigger fish to fry here. We often talk on this program about when does the free market work and when doesn't the free market work. And when it comes to something like healthcare, I've said it should not be in the so-called free or open market. We should eliminate the profit motive from providing healthcare to people because the demand for healthcare is completely inelastic, and it just simply should not be operating under a free market. When it comes to internet service providers, though, part of the problem is, and part of why internet service providers treat customers so terribly and regularly are the most hated companies nationally, is that they offer terrible service at a high price because there is no competition or almost no competition. And if states, instead of passing executive orders that just say, we will only deal with ISPs as a customer, as a state customer, that don't do this or don't do that. If instead they tried to deal with the fact that we have almost no legislation to prevent these de facto monopolies that exist in most places around the country, you would very quickly see that the need for net neutrality rules goes way down. I'm not saying that if we did the dealing with the monopolies, we can just forget about net neutrality. I think we should have both. But if you actually get these ISPs competing, you are going to have a drastically different situation. Not going to happen anytime soon. These are deliberately constructed monopolies by design. And that's because an ISP will come in. And I admit, there's a lot of spending that has to be done to establish the infrastructure for high-speed internet and cable in a city. But the ISP will come in and they'll say, well, we will set up shop in your city, town, municipality, whatever, but you need to commit to only doing business with us. And it's a real problem for bigger cities. We've seen small places. There's hill towns out in western Massachusetts that have done this. I think Leverett and Shutesbury, who are small enough that they can do municipal broadband. But that is not the majority of places. A lot of cities, especially cities that financially are not doing well, just can't afford to do that. And that's something that needs to be dealt with. Google Fiber can sort of help to deal with it, although development has really slowed down. Maybe something like Elon Musk's satellite internet could help. But the states are going to need to deal with that, the cities maybe, if we really want to have a shot at fixing this thing. We have a fantastic bonus show for you today. I'm out of time, but trust me, it's a good one. No voicemail today either, because I was ranting about net neutrality and monopolies. But we've got a great bonus show for you, and we'll talk to you on the program tomorrow as well.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.